I don't know why I like it. I just always have.
This is a conscious effort on our part to open the creative envelope, so to speak, in order to entertain you in a more contemporary manner. Even though we call ourselves sports entertainment because of the athleticism involved, the key word in that phrase is entertainment.
Vince McMahon has lost his mind. The man doesn't have it anymore.
We in the WWF think that you, the audience, are quite frankly tired of having your intelligence insulted.
Have you watched the television show lately?
We also think that you're tired of the same old simplistic theory of good guys versus bad guys. Therefore, we've embarked upon a far more innovative and contemporary creative campaign that is far more invigorating and extemporaneous than ever before.
Because while Doink the Clown had a green hair and a rubber nose, Stone Cold Steve Austin was drinking his first beer in ECW, damn you. Oh, we got attitude. You got nothing, man.
As the times have changed, so have we.
Welcome back to Beyond The Beermat. My name is Stuart Quigley. You heard from me earlier today. If you actually listened to the podcast we did earlier, when we did it earlier, and if you did, fair play, I applaud you. We're getting to you again with another special whereby my name is Stuart Quigley. Alongside me is, actually no one again, because wrestling fans are lonely and ultimately I have to sit by myself. That being said, we're going to get into this special pre-WrestleMania podcast, which is, I want to talk about the idea that NXT and the whole WrestleMania sort of weekend has almost been usurped by this behemoth that is, and behemoth of goodwill, because NXT can do no wrong. NXT could have, shall we say, a character that pretend to call his mother, and he could get the Bridge Club out of his mother. I'm not gonna lie, it's hard to provide such sarcasm. I think I've had like an IV of pure sarcasm just while I'm doing that, but still. The funny thing about all that and all the bullshit side is it's easy to make fun of a character like the Funkasaurus. If someone's just what that, nah, Jesus Christ. But it's easy to be that guy, it's easy to take the piss. But I think fundamentally, if you go backwards, if you try and sort of reverse engineer this whole character, storyline, everything, it's a lot easier because of the dividing line between NXT and the main roster. But at the end of the day, I don't really want to go into too much because, like, they're characters. And at the end of the day, when you sit down and you think, okay, someone like The Ascension, you think, where does the blame lie on that? Which is weird because there's so many facets and so many different moving parts that go into not just someone getting over, but like a tag team specifically. But I do think this applies across the board, not just one person, but even a tag team. The way they're booked, the way they wrestle, this, that, the other. There are many moving parts. You can have a shit storyline and still get over. And you can be a sort of shit wrestler and have a decent-ish storyline and still get over. I think The Ascension is sort of the perfect example, actually, ironically enough. Sort of stumbled onto that, much like NXT stumbled onto them, which is, there's a level of hype that you get that you won't be able to replicate in a bigger arena. And I take that with the biggest pinch of salt, because the way NXT is booked is infinitely different to the way WWE main roster is booked. And that's kind of the point of this podcast, ultimately. I do think it's very important to point out and one of the reasons we're doing this, I say I'm doing this, is that I think the attitude to both is very different as well. If anyone that has come up from NXT and has not necessarily hit the heights that you would expect them to, EC3 is a decent example. I'd go so far as to say, like, Sanity is an even better example, actually. If you implant them back into NXT without any sort of changing to their music, direction, look, whatever, crowd react. The NXT crowd is sort of programmed to react positively to anything. And it's interesting, actually, because I think wrestling fans in general, and this is true very specifically of the main roster, they're programmed to react negatively. I know I'm very guilty of this, and I'm going to hold my hands up the idea of when you see people on the main roster that are being called up, you're like, oh, I've heard a lot about this person. They're supposed to be amazing. I'm fully on board with them being amazing. And then, like, after one Raw whereby they didn't, like, roundhouse The Rock and punch Steve Austin in the balls, like, if they didn't do those two specific things that I've just mentioned, then they are terrible and they have absolutely nothing. Again, I do think there is a massive difference in terms of the way these lads are booked in NXT and the way these lads are booked on the main roster. And when I say lads, by the way, I mean women as well. So don't hashtag me too on all of this. I actually think the women's aspect of this is even more interesting because we've gotten used to, as a wrestling fan base, women coming up to the main roster and doing spectacularly well. Baylor, that was a bad choice to start this list with. Sasha Banks, Charlotte, Becky Lynch, and there is a bridge, I would say, between like the likes of Shayna Baszler, Kairi Sane. I do think they're slightly fortunate in a certain degree because when the generation that I just mentioned, the Becky Lynches and that, came up, they had a reputation about them of putting on these amazing matches, and to start with at least they didn't. And I do think this is actually true of probably 90% of the NXT called up roster. So this isn't exclusively to the women, but just you can't necessarily match what the predisposed hope was, if you want to call it that. And I'm not sure whether it's fortunate that there isn't the same quite level of hype, because there is a level of hype of Shayna Baszler, Kairi Sane, and certain women's wrestlers in NXT, but it's not quite to the same level. There's a huge difference between a crowd that's all in on wrestling versus a crowd that's just paid to see wrestling. And I'm not saying this in a harsh way. I'm not saying this in a sort of marks, like ridiculous way. But what I mean is going to see actual wrestling, going to put your money down because you love to see wrestling, you know, that's great, versus putting your money down to see, just to do something, just to be out on the night. And specifically in a country as big as America, and specifically in the touring schedule they have, I think the split between the people in the crowd that really want to be there versus the people that are just doing something is hugely different to an NXT crowd, which is like filled with like the biggest hipsters you've ever seen, that if you weren't on row 3, seat 4C of Crown Jewel and weren't streaming on your phone, then you're not a good wrestling fan. You know, that's difficult to accept. And the NXT crowd, as much as I'm trying to sort of have a go at hipsters, is very partisan, I think is the right word I'd use. And I don't blame them. I really do think that this is the best way to go. I do think that when you watch Raw, SmackDown, Shikara, NXT, Ring of Honor, TNA, Impact Wrestling, I know they're the same thing, there's a certain level of, I love this, but, and with NXT, the level of acceptance seems to be so much higher than any other existence, really. Because when you watch, I think Adam Rose is a good example to suggest. Like when he's coming out on NXT shows and getting the reactions that he's getting, and you read that. If you don't watch the matches, and I'm not saying he's a bad wrestler, this is not a judgment on his wrestling ability at all. But when you read that, you go, oh, crowd's going quite mad for Adam Rose. I need to check this guy out. And in turn, that sort of facilitates him going to the main roster. It's literally as simple as buzz creates buzz. But with the NXT thing, 100% those guys in the crowd are as cynical as you or I listening to this. Because fundamentally, I'm talking about this and you're listening to a wrestling podcast that isn't one of the mainstream wrestling podcasts. It's the best wrestling podcast, but it's not one of the mainstream ones. So, A, thank you for listening, and B, thank you for agreeing with me in advance, which is, there's no real issues when the crowd are all on your side. The problem you've got is when the crowd aren't necessarily all on your side, which is when NXT moves from the guy doing whatever he's doing, he could whip his dick out and helicopter it for most of the NXT crowd, and no one cares. It's not PG, but like no one cares. It'd be interesting actually to see a guy that's that over and isn't allowed to be on TV because all he does is whip his dick out. So he's completely censored, but people still cheer him. All the cheers, all the will in the world of these NXT guys. And when you broadcast that further, when you pitch that further, the percentage of the audience that's loving them is still a percentage, and the percentage of the audience that loves them is less, because the percentage of the audience at an NXT show versus the percentage of the audience at a generic house show in bumfuck Idaho is a lot different, and the reactions are going to be a lot different. And I do think actually as well that the way they treat these NXT call-ups is massively different than what they used to have. Remember the Brock Lesnar just suddenly turning up the day after WrestleMania and throwing people and killing people basically. You kind of expect that now. Like, imagine if there was the Brock Lesnar equivalent in NXT. And I think Pete Dunne, given the fact that he's dropped the UK title, is very sort of on this scale. The day after WrestleMania, turns up, destroys people. It's a little on the nose. It's interesting because what you want from a developmental company is this idea that these guys who aren't necessarily ready for the quote-unquote big stage, you want them to be able to perform in certain audiences, and you want them to get over in those audiences. And there's a huge difference between the OVW and the old school developmental territories and NXT, because I think NXT is a bona fide star making factory, whereas before the developmental was purely making them learn the ropes. And I mean that sort of figuratively and literally, just sort of let's learn the WWE style. And the lads that go in there, Rob Conway, Nick Dinsmore, they're better wrestlers than that sort of entanglement suggests. Whereas NXT has, and again, this is sort of Triple H driven, gone to that theory, but the extreme. You're not allowed to go on to a WWE thing, not show, not pay-per-view, segment, YouTube clip, probably not even allowed to piss in certain toilets. You probably have to piss on yourself, I'm not going to lie. Specifically if Bradshaw's there, but the NXT process from TakeOver and Mania, there's definitely a hierarchy in WWE, and not only is there definitely a hierarchy, there's definitely a trapdoor with which you can sort of fall in. And for most of these NXT guys, you can't know you've gone down the trapdoor until you've gone down the trapdoor. But we're in a moment now where someone like Johnny Gargano becoming the new NXT World Champion, and his future is almost the same as Ciampa's in the sense that you can see so much potential, so much hope, and there's a sort of, oh please put your hands in front of your face and be scared in terms of what would happen to them. And I know for a fact that like Ciampa's injury makes it a lot more difficult. But I think what I would say is, I've heard this before, and I genuinely can't credit it because I can't remember the person that said it, but one of the most amazing sort of threads I've ever pulled on, if you want to call it that, is this idea that Triple H is the exact same character he is on the main roster as he is in NXT. And the problem with him being a heel on one side and a face on another side is sort of almost this idea of the difference between the main roster and NXT. Triple H is in the main roster is an absolute arsehole who's the game, and we can call Motorhead up and get them to maybe remember half of their song. And you know, like, he's very egotistical, destroys good wrestlers before they're good wrestlers. I don't know, like, that's him on the main roster. In NXT, he's fun, friendly, oh my god, I'm giving you a chance. It's like Oprah Winfrey, but with title shots. Like, everybody gets a title shot, you get a title shot, you get a title shot. It's amazing, and the hope that you get with Triple H in NXT versus the hope you get with Triple H in the main roster, it's very different. Triple H, when he sees these guys on the NXT, he's like, yeah, you're good at wrestling. You're good at wrestling. This guy's also good at wrestling. Some of you have more extravagant entrances than others, but a lot of you are really great at putting together wrestling matches. As someone that wants to put wrestling matches together that are of high quality, I'd enjoy putting you in that scenario. Pretty sure that's how he talks, by the way. And when he gets to the main roster, the optimism is gone. It's full on pessimism. It's full on best for business. It's, oh shit, no one cares. Oh God, I hate this. Why am I doing this? I fuck it. Do you know what? I'll just do Baron Corbin versus Kurt Angle because they're two people that I know that exist. And I also think that in terms of the Triple H, the character study that I've just said, that works very similarly to the audience and brings us back to what I started the podcast talking about, which is when something debuts in NXT, everyone loses their mind. Oh mate, this is amazing, this is going to be great. Like, I remember, and I'm going to start soft and I'm going to end hard, which is definitely what she said, which is Enzo and Big Cass. And again, I'd like to sort of reiterate to myself, you made an erection joke and you're starting with Enzo. Great. They were really big, like, fucking euphemisms all over the place in NXT. And when they translated it onto the roster, you know, that worked because they worked really, really well on NXT. And you don't have to be the best wrestlers in the world. And fuck me, Big Cass and Enzo were not the best wrestlers in the world. And they still managed to carve themselves a niche onto the main roster. But the last point I was going to make is it's very easy to get wrapped up in and cling yourself to the idea of what's coming next, because what's coming now and what's already happened is, it's easy to talk shit on it. It's easy to be soft on, like, yeah, it's here, it's not great, it's happened, shit. And do you know what? It's fine. It's fine to breathe. It's fine to just take a second. NXT has made a massive leap in terms of the idea of what's going to come. We get used to these guys and they are on our television screens / laptop / iPad / whatever we're watching when we're bored screens. And ultimately, the booking when they get to the main roster will be very different to how they book now. And ultimately, Triple H, as we just mentioned, no, it's not going to work necessarily. It's probably going to like beat most of them at WrestleMania himself. But speaking of WrestleMania, 24 hours more. This time tomorrow, we'll be fully immersed in the pre-show. And the pre-show will be having a smattering of NXT characters. I would love, actually, if we had, at WrestleMania, I know the whole consensus of Kurt Angle's match against Baron Corbin, and for the love of God, if that ends the way it's supposed to, then jeez. But there's a rumour about like John Cena interrupts. But if there's an NXT guy that interrupts, that could be the moment they need. And we're all sceptical, but if you're given the moment, if you're given the choice, if you're given this, we all want them to succeed. This has been Beyond the Beermat, and we will see you again. We've had 2 podcasts in one day, and you'll get another one from us tomorrow. So please choke on that, slap nuts. Jesus Christ, did I really end this podcast on a Jeff Jarrett quote? Apparently I did.